Grain. Henry Hudson reported the Hudson Valley as rich farmland when he first saw it. The Dutch settlers used it for raising grain. We read of barley straw 7 feet high, and of bumper crops of wheat raised on the same ground 11 years in succession. Tobacco growing was introduced by some Virginians about 1635, and everybody wanted to rush into it and get rich. But the wise West India Company ruled that there must be an acre of grain raised for every acre of tobacco. They thus saved the soil and maintained a solid prosperity. There was no farm machinery. Ripe grain had to be cut by hand with a sickle, a scythe, or a cradle, then tied to bundles and hauled to a barn where it could be kept dry for later threshing. Only a sickle could be used in a field that still had stumps in it. A 17th century sickle, though it was similar in shape to a modern one and intended for use with one hand only, was considerably larger than its descendant and far handsomer. A scythe and a reaping sickle. A wooden hay fork. A scythe was and still is swung with both arms. Its 3-foot blade projects sideways, one can't say at a right angle, from the end of the artfully double-curved snath of wood on which are mounted 2 projecting handholds. The angles of these and the curves of the snath allow a standing man to sweep the blade along just above the ground. A cradle isn't often used anymore. It's not needed, and there are few left who have the skill and stamina to handle one. It was, essentially, a scythe with an added wooden frame above the blade. On this the cut grain fell, the straws lying neatly parallel, so the cradle gathered the grain as it cut it. Considering the added weight of the frame and that of the grain on top of it, it can be seen that a good man with a scythe wasn't necessarily good enough to stay with a cradle. Once the crop was in the barn, it could be threshed piecemeal on days when the weather didn't allow outside work, though it couldn't lie around too long or it would shatter and the mice would get it. Threshing was done by thumping the straw with hand flails until the kernels were knocked out of the heads onto the barn floor. The flail was simply a club, swiveled with leather at the end of a handle about 6 feet long. Threshing with flails. After it was thoroughly beaten and turned and beaten again, the straw was gathered up with a homemade wooden fork and stored to be used as animal bedding. What was left on the floor was a mixture of grain and chaff, which is the hulls and beards. This had to be swept up and winnowed, usually by hauling it up to the barn loft and pouring it onto a sheet spread below. By opening the doors on opposite sides of the barns, a through draft was created that blew most of the light chaff out as the heavier grain fell. The chaff went down the necks and into the hair of everybody on the place. On still days, big winnowing fans could be used, but only with back-breaking effort, so most people waited for a breeze. A post windmill. Milling. Nothing could be more natural than for the Dutch to set up windmills to grind their grain to flour. The earliest known picture of New Amsterdam shows one of these. The general outward appearance of a windmill is familiar, a tower with 4 long arms. These arms are feathered a little and are made to revolve by the pressure of the wind blowing against the sails stretched on them. Modern mills in Holland and England have means of changing the angle of the feathering and automatic devices to keep the sails facing the wind. In earlier days, the vanes were rigid, and the necessary changes to adjust for wind direction had to be made by moving a long pole that had its upper end attached to the mill and its lower end reaching the ground. It was a common practice to equip the bottom of the pole with a wheel to ease the job of moving it. This wheel wore a circular track all the way around the mill. 2 types of windmill were used in America, neither one exclusively anywhere. The more common mill was the post type. It was a box-like structure set quite literally on a huge, heavily braced post. To get inside, it was usually necessary to climb a ladder and enter through a trap door in the floor. To head its sail into the wind, the whole structure was rotated on its post. The smock mill, which was the other kind, sat solidly on the ground and could be entered by a normal door. Its wheeled pole didn't move the whole building, but only a mushroom-shaped cap. A windmill's vanes turned a not quite horizontal axle that in turn rotated a long vertical shaft by means of ingeniously made wooden gears. These made use of pegs as teeth and are more easily understood from a drawing than from description. The lower end of the long shaft turned the upper of 2 millstones. These were an enlargement of the hand quern that was described in the section about New England. The stones were usually called burrs. Some were chipped from a single block, but many of them were made up of segments carefully fitted and hooped together with heavy iron bands. The lower stone was fixed and had grooves in its upper surface to promote grinding and to move the material across it. The two stones were enclosed and raw grain was dribbled to them through a hopper by hand. Later, an automatic jiggling regulator known as a damsel was invented. Various means were used to raise the grain to the top of the mill so that it could be run down on the burrs. The simplest was a drum hoist that hauled the bags up by a rope like the one illustrated. Later mills had elevators running in enclosed channels. Square channels carried belts with small buckets on them. Round ones had central shafts with wooden pegs set around them in a long spiral. These raised the loose grain as they rotated, using the principle discovered by Archimedes. All three kinds were powered by the sails. After the grain was ground, it had still to be bolted by sifting it through meshes of increasing fineness. The coarser parts, the bran and middlings, could be fed to animals. The fine end product was, of course, flour, if the grain was wheat or rye. Wheat flour was bolted twice, being reground between boltings. Corn cannot readily be ground to the fineness of wheat flour. A grist mill run by a water wheel wasn't different from one driven by sails, except that its power came from below and hence a different arrangement of the mechanism was necessary. Some explanation of the working of water wheels will be given further along in connection with the southern sawmill. From Canada to Virginia, both watermills and windmills ground grain and sawed wood. New Amsterdam. For most of the 17th century, the town on the tip of Manhattan Island was as completely Dutch as homesickness could make it, even to the ordering of a tidal inlet into the semblance of a short canal. With a cobbled lane on either side, the canal made a good place to land small boats and a bridge over it. Not too far from the present stock exchange was the favorite trading spot for businessmen. The English filled in the canal and named it Broad Street. Traces of the Dutch village exist chiefly as place names now, such as Spuyten Duyvil, Coyote Slip, and the Bowery. The interior mechanism of a windmill. Wind vanes with canvas sails, counterwheel or gear, lantern or pinion, windlass drive, hopper, millstones or cover cutaway, chute de bin, mile bin, sifting meal with a Thames, axle post, grain. Most of the larger houses followed the custom of Holland and had rather whimsical weather vanes on their roofs. The weather was a topic as interesting then as today. The rattle watch on his rounds hourly disturbed the night by announcing time and weather. There was then no knob to turn that would shut him off, but his voice, echoing in the silent street, let his employers know he was still on the job. The rattle he carried was made just like the modern celebration noisemaker, in which a springy stick clatters on a toothed wheel, but it was larger and louder. It was used only to call for help in some emergency, like a fire. The streets the watch guarded weren't totally dark, but they were nearly so. An ordinance required every seventh house to hang out a lantern on a pole during the dark of the moon. The houses between lanterns had to contribute candles. Watchman's hourglass, rattle, lantern, and mitten. Dutch vlieboot on the Hudson. Indian wampum. New Amsterdam was the trading center for the colony. Shops did business on the ground floors of many houses. A lot of them were run by women. There was a scarcity of small change in America from its settlement until after it took over its own affairs. In New Netherland and in New England, the need was filled for years by setting an arbitrary value on the Indians' bead wampum. The beads were laboriously made from quahog shells, and a higher value was put on those made from the purple part than on the white ones. It worked well until some smart white men started mass production of wampum with steel tools. The market was flooded and the value of the stuff vanished. Goods never had fixed prices in the 17th century except when they were set by law, as in the case of bread. Even small purchases were made by bargaining. The shopkeeper asked more than he thought he could get, and the buyer offered less than he was willing to pay. Since both understood that, it all was a waste of time. The Quakers, settling wherever they could in the latter part of the century, brought with them conscience and common sense that required them to ask a fair price and stick to it. Quietly they brought the rest of the world to their way of thinking. Supplies for the back country and furs, grain, and tobacco from the back country were carried on the Hudson in sloops or vlieboats. When the river froze, transportation stopped, but communication was maintained by couriers who skated all alone through the Great Gorge. Of course, all Dutchmen could skate. A courier to Fort Orange. An ancient pattern skate. The sharp pin was stuck into the shoe heel. People and clothes. The people of New Netherland had a good time whenever they could. Sleighing and skating parties were frequent, and kissing games enlivened indoor parties. The sport of coasting downhill on a sled was introduced by the Dutch, perhaps because hills were a novelty to them. A visiting lady from New England saw boys sledding in Albany, and after trying it out privately, gave it a low rating. What a pity no one could have recorded the experiment with a movie camera. Weddings, christenings, and funerals were all times of social exuberance. Not only did the bride's father entertain at a wedding, but next day the groom's father kept open house. Whenever it was necessary to collect money for a public project or for the church poor, the collectors waited for a wedding and made their touch when everybody was in good humor and a little gone in wine. This became an established custom. The bills for liquor and food for some of the funerals show that a good time must have been had by all. There were seldom any poor in the sense of economic misfits. Any able-bodied person could make a living, but people became too old or too sick to work, and they were cared for by the church. It was a Dutch custom to bind a bargain by dropping money in the poor box. The Dutch were a religious people, but most of them weren't stuffy about it. Attendance at church was expected, but not compulsory. There were rules about Sunday behavior. Taverns weren't supposed to sell liquor during church hours. Sunday work, playing at bowls, and games were outlawed, and so was drunken drinking. Prosperity and a natural love for finery inclined the New Netherlands to dress far more richly than the Puritans were able or willing to do. The Dutch followed the general style of the time with variations of their own. In an age of ballooning breeches, a Dutchman's outswelled all others. His hat was a big plumed hat, not too well suited to his stocky build. Shoe buckles seem to have been popular with the Dutch before the other nations began to wear them. On the other hand, the prosperous among the Dutch clung to the starched ruff for some time after the English had abandoned it for the wide limp collar known as a falling band. Right out of the bandbox originally meant nothing more than a clean collar. Ruffs were a great nuisance and a great expense. They had to be laundered by experts. Some of the women who goffered them, when they were fashionable in London, made modest fortunes at it. The starched flutes or gophers were arranged on setting sticks and fixed into shapes with hot metal poking sticks. Even then it was necessary to wear wire under proper to hold a ruff up. The starch used was frequently colored, perhaps because it showed dirt less easily. Collecting for the poor. Blue and goose, green were popular colors, so was yellow until a notorious murderess wore a yellow ruff to her execution. Dutch women wore as many petticoats as did the Puritan women, but they wore them striped and a lot shorter, to expose some length of dashling clocked stocking. The fair New Netherlander wore a narrow girdle around her waist. Hanging from it, by ribbons or chains, was almost everything she might be likely to need: keys, scissors, pincushion, and a couple of embroidered pockets for extras. Instead of or over the bodice, this lady often wore a loose, full-sleeved jacket. Covering her tightly pulled-back hair, she wore a quilted cap. Irving says of calico, but in view of the rarity of cotton, it was more likely made of printed linen. Much printing of linen was done in Holland. Like the English youngsters, Dutch children were dressed as small adults, with the single difference that they wore wooden shoes. These were probably worn by farmers and workmen too, as they still are in the Netherlands. They are very practical in mud, if your feet can stand them. Children had a good time in New Netherland. They were loved, and they weren't expected to behave like aldermen. Once in a while they got into some devilment and annoyed a minor functionary who has left behind his plaintive report. There were few schools for some years, and those that existed were plagued with a series of drunken schoolmasters. After the English took over, they forbade the use of Dutch in schools. One teacher, who was himself Dutch and no drunk, evolved a smart system for enforcing this. He issued a metal disc each day to the first boy who slipped into Dutch. The boys had the right to get rid of it by the same means, and he who held the token at the day's end was thrashed by the master. It happens that the Dutch word for blunder is bok. Can we have here the origin of the honored American custom of passing the buck? The old Dutch custom of giving presents to children on December 5th, the eve of St. Nicholas, when the saint was supposed to reward the good and turn the bad over for punishment to his servant, Black Ruprecht, became fused after 1664 with the English celebration of Christmas. Ruprecht vanished, but the jolly gentleman we know as Santa Claus is a neat blend of the gentle saint and the rollicking Father Christmas. Dr. Clement Moore, who wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas in New York, may have had something to do with the blending. The now faded American custom of calling on all the neighbors on New Year's Day started in New Netherland. New Year's was a great holiday with them. So was May Day, when maypoles were set up, and Shrovetide, when boisterous sports were in order, some of them involving regrettable cruelty to animals. Pinkster Day, at Whitsuntide, was a peculiarly Dutch celebration, a day for tricks and skylarking.